Good morning, everyone. My name is Elaine Kmark. I'm a senior fellow here at the Brookings Institution, and welcome to our webinar on the 2024 congressional primaries and the future of American politics. Let me remind everyone that if you'd like to send questions via email, you can send them to events@brookings.edu, or via Twitter or X, you can send them to brookingsgov #congressional primaries. In 2014, we here at Brookings began studying the candidates running for Congress. Unlike many studies of congressional elections in political science, and unlike most journalists' coverage of elections, the Brookings studies focused on all congressional candidates who got themselves on a primary ballot, whether they were serious challengers in competitive races or dilettantes who were not really expected to win. We chose to study the universe of congressional primary candidates for one important reason. Over the years, congressional districts have become less competitive and safer for one party or the other. As a result, attention has shifted towards primaries, and the action sometimes has shifted towards primaries, and they have emerged as an important motivator in the behavior of congressmen and women and senators who fear being primaried, a phrase that was put into our vocabulary by the political scientist Robert Boatwright. Even though in primaries, and as in the general election, very few incumbents fail to win re-election, the fear of being primaried leads incumbent senators and representatives to anticipate challenges and adapt to the possibility of being primaried. And often that leads them to listen to the most extremes of their party. This is one important contributor to the political polarization that has become such a feature of modern American politics. Myself and James Wallner at the R Street Institute did a piece of political science on incumbents. We interviewed a whole lot of congressional candidates, members of Congress, and we found that incumbents, first of all, they worry about a primary threat. Secondly, they believe primary contests hurt their chances in the general election. Third, they often, in their own minds, exaggerate the importance of successful primary challenges. And finally, believe that changes in their own behavior help defeat or defer primary challenges. Today, I want to present some of the findings from the fifth study Brookings has conducted on candidates who run for Congress in both parties. As you can imagine, this is a huge data file, and we are still combing through the data. But we'd like to present this today because a lot of people are curious about not only what's going to happen in the presidential race in November, but what's going to happen to Congress. And so there are some clues, perhaps, in what Congress might be like in January of 2025, and I'd like to show you some of them here. I'm going to share my screen for a moment, and here we go. Okay, let me just put this over here, and all righty. Let's go to the first slide. We looked at 1,845 total candidates. We're excluding about 100 third-party primaries in here. Slightly more Republicans than Democrats in this group. Here's some of the basic demographic information by gender. As you can see, about 25% of all candidates were women, 75% were men. One of the things that we then looked at, which I didn't put a slide on, is there were 295 women who ran in primary races that did not have incumbents in them. And one of the things we see in here is that, of course, so many men are incumbents, or so many incumbents are men, and incumbents generally win their primaries. So by looking at these 295 women who ran in primary races without an incumbent, we found that they did pretty well. 47% of them actually won their primaries. So it's 25% seems like a low number, but it's actually got some good news for women in it. Race and identity, most of the candidates were white. Black candidates were mostly Democrats, as you can see, and as you would expect. Hispanic and AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander candidates, were actually kind of divided pretty equally between the two parties, okay? And while the number of black candidates is about equal to their proportion in the overall population, the number of Hispanic candidates is obviously low. I would attribute that to many things, but I think one of the simplest is that the Hispanic population is a very young population. So a lot of people aren't at the point where they are, ready to run for office. There were other demographic issues, and there were a few surprises. The vast majority of these congressional candidates had either a college degree or a graduate degree, and they were much more educated than the general public. Most were Christian. A large number of evangelicals ran as Republicans. Almost no Democrats were evangelicals. Slightly more than half of all of our candidates were married. 3% were openly gay, which was up from 1.6% in 2022, and 17% had served in the military. Next, I want to turn to candidate ideology. This is one of the most important things we were looking for in this study, which is what is the division of ideology within each big political party. Each candidate was coded for where they seemed to fit in their party. The candidate's own self-identification was very important. And many people simply said things like, I'm a MAGA Republican, or I'm an American First Republican, or I'm a progressive Democrat. But we also used other items in their websites and in their social media to categorize them. For instance, we looked at how they talked about January 6th and the 2020 election, which was an important clue as to how MAGA they were. As you can see from this slide, most Republicans ran as MAGA candidates, a number that is consistent with the long-running narrative that Donald Trump has gradually taken over the Republican Party.
Elaine, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're not seeing your slides.
You're not seeing my slides? Oh my goodness. I don't know what that share screen. All right, I'm going to have to, uh-oh. I thought nobody told me that. I thought I was, okay. I'm very sorry about this. And I'm going to have to go to, okay, and now I'm going to have to put this up. Honey, it's funny because I'm seeing them, but let me, all right, share.
Okay, we see it. If you could just take that full screen in the PowerPoint and we'll be good.
Okay, all right, the full screen is, okay. Are you seeing it?
We're still seeing we're seeing them, but we're also seeing a lot of your desktop. There you go. Click on that. There you go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are you seeing it now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, I am so sorry about that. Did you miss the first two?
Yes, we did.
All right, then I'm going to go right. Here's very quickly, here's the total candidates and the number of Republicans and Democrats. Here is their breakdown by gender. Here's the breakdown by race and ethnicity. And here we are at political identification. So, okay, where we were, I'm very sorry about that. Um, Most Republican candidates ran as MAGA candidates, a number that is consistent with what everybody sees as the Trump takeover of the Republican Party. And in fact, he increased the number of candidates running as MAGA candidates increased from 2022 to 2024. In 2022, 36% of Republicans ran as MAGA candidates, and this year it was 45%. So it's a considerable increase. On the Democratic side, you can see that there were more mainstream Democrats running than progressive Democrats, and the mainstream Democrats outperformed the progressives, winning 67% of their races. As for Democratic Socialists, they are even scarcer than moderate Republicans. We counted only 6 socialists out of 841 Democrats. Another way to conceptualize ideology is to look at some of the flashpoints in American modern politics and examine their salience in the congressional primaries. Take, for instance, the call to defund the police that rocketed to prominence in 2020 and turned out to be very unpopular with the broader electorate. So much so that the revered Democratic Congressman Jim Clyburn and many others blamed it for the loss of several congressional seats in 2025. By the 2024 primaries, however, that slogan had been widely discredited, even though calls for police reform had not been. Only 13 candidates, 0.15% of all the Democratic candidates, even used the phrase in their campaign materials. And I'll show you a slide on that in a moment. Another flashpoint on the Democratic side appeared midway through the primary season as protests broke out on college campuses against Israel's military actions in Gaza, creating a split in the Democratic Party. Some people were predicting in the spring, as these primaries were going on, that Joe Biden's 2024 convention in Chicago was going to be as tumultuous as the 1968 Democratic convention in Chicago. However, only 69, when we looked at the congressional candidates, we really did not see what the action on campus was seeing. Only 69 Democratic candidates, or 8% of all of them, mentioned genocide or called for or some sort of total opposition for U.S. support for Israel. More called for a ceasefire or conditions on American aid to Israel, but overall either supported Israel unconditionally or supported Israel along with calls for humanitarian aid. On the Republican side, the flashpoints tended to be around the legitimacy of the 2020 election. Only 45 Republicans, 5% of those candidates, said that Biden won the election fairly. Fully 23% said Biden's win was a big lie, or that the election should have been investigated further. However, most Republican candidates, 723 or 72% of the total, simply stayed away from the topic altogether. Similarly, 820 Republicans, or 82% of the candidates, refused to discuss the January 6th riot at the Capitol. It's interesting because these findings, which we were seeing all along in the primary season, underscore the advice that political professionals kept giving to Donald Trump to stay away from the past. So, in sum, the picture that emerges from our look at the congressional candidates, and there's a lot of other data that I will come to some of it, is as follows. While the Republican Party has been transformed by Trump, the transformation is not complete. There are still mainstream Democrats running for Congress, and they win about as often as the MAGA candidates do. So it's not a total takeover. Republican congressional candidates did not think that running on complaints about the 2020 election made for good politics, something the Trump campaign is still grappling with. The Democratic Party is not nearly as left-wing as their critics like to make them out to be. Only 7 candidates, 6 House candidates, 1 Senate candidate, out of all the Democratic candidates identified with democratic socialism, and only half of them won their primaries. Incendiary talk about defunding the police practically disappeared from the 2024 primary, and opposition to Israel's military objections in Gaza was much smaller than anticipated. Some years ago, the political scientists Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann popularized the notion of asymmetric polarization and argued that it was worse among elites, such as lawmakers on the Republican side, than it was on lawmakers on the Democratic side. And the ongoing work of the Primaries Project, we've found this for years now, offers evidence that polarization is worse on the Republican side. Moving far right is more enthusiastically embraced by Republican voters than it is by Democratic voters. This sums up the slides that were most frequently addressed. The following sums up the slides that were most frequently addressed by the 2024 candidates. Now, let me pause and say many of these candidates did not have positions on all the issues of the day. Unsurprisingly, incumbents had the most thorough set of issue positions because, of course, they have to vote. They issue press releases on the issues of the day. But most candidates concentrated on only a couple of issues. Sometimes it's because they were sort of rookie candidates and they cared about one or two things. That's what got them into the race, and that's all they talked about. And search as we might, we could find them offering no opinion on anything else. But for most that's why for most candidates there were a lot of don't knows or didn't mention for all the issues. These issues, however, on this slide are the issues that were most mentioned. These are the top issues. As evident, some of them, immigration, guns, police reform, and taxes, were discussed more by Republican candidates than Democratic candidates. And similarly, abortion, climate change, and healthcare were discussed more by Democrats than Republicans. And this is consistent with our findings in previous years. The issues are slightly different. Climate actually moved up in the number of issues discussed this year. But basically, these are sort of the issues that get people going. Obviously, abortion moved up from 2020 and 2016 when it wasn't really an issue. But it also is what also is consistent about this is that, and we find this through all the research we've done, is that in primaries, Democrats and Republicans really do talk about different things because they are talking to the base of their party. The top issue for Republicans was immigration, with an overwhelming number of congressional candidates saying that they would either close the border or otherwise secure it by, for instance, building a wall, arresting and deporting people, etc. Almost no Democrats took this position, with 52% expressing concern for the immigration problem and supporting comprehensive immigration reform, which meant, as you can imagine, a variety of things to a variety of people. For some years now, Democrats have been accused of favoring open borders, but only 3 Democrats out of 841 Democrats mentioned a position in favor of open borders, such as, for instance, abolishing ICE in their campaign materials. So this was not, this again, further proof that some of this far left stuff is probably overemphasized. On abortion, for Democrats, this was the top issue. Only 16% of Democratic candidates failed to mention abortion in their campaign materials. However, no one really on this question got into many details. The vast majority of Democrats, 78%, said they were simply pro-choice without much elaboration. 37% of Republican candidates failed to mention the abortion issue at all. Of those who did, very few took the pro-choice position, and most of them simply stated that they were pro-life with no elaboration. Once in a while, the evangelical candidates would really, get into the topic, but by and large, they didn't. And on the critical question, which will be facing the next Congress, of whether or not Congress should enact a bill enshrining the right to abortion, most Democrats were in favor, but 77% of Republicans, not surprisingly, simply did not mention the issue. So I don't know exactly what that means. Maybe our panel will help us think about that. Other widely discussed issues on the issue of guns and the Second Amendment, the parties were mirror images of each other, with 69% of Democrats saying we need stronger gun laws and 73% of Republicans asserting their support for the Second Amendment and opposition to any new gun laws. On policing and criminal justice, Democrats mostly favored reform of police forces, as mentioned earlier. Defund the police made an appearance only in 13 out of 841 Democratic races. Republicans were nearly unanimously on the side of supporting law enforcement, and no one even talked about reform. On health care, which, as you'll remember, was an issue, a big issue in the 2018 midterms, Nancy Pelosi said that was the issue. Most Democrats were in favor of expanding and protecting the Affordable Care Act, but a substantial measure, also 30%, also favored a single-payer plan like Medicare for All. By and large, Republicans stayed away from the issue of health care in general. And if they did go into it, it was to talk about controlling costs. If the Democrats ever come back to the House in substantial numbers, I suspect that this issue of the ACA versus Medicare for All might blossom into a bigger fight. On climate change, 40% of Democrats expressed general concern for the environment, and 35% identified climate as the most pressing issue before us. This was a big change from past years when the climate change issue was not very high on the priority list of many Democratic candidates. Republicans generally dealt with it by ignoring climate change. 57% did not address it in their campaign materials. And of those who did, they tended to say that, yes, climate change was real, but it should not be at the cost of ruining the economy. Only 6% of Republican candidates were outright climate deniers, compared to 15% of the general public, by the way. Finally, the two big foreign policy issues that were front and center during this year's primaries, the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine. As mentioned earlier, the Democrats had some internal divisions, but none as large as had been anticipated in the spring when campuses were seeing riots and protests. In contrast, the Republicans were united in their unconditional support for Israel. When it came to Ukraine, the situation flipped. Democrats were very united in their support of military and economic aid for Ukraine, while a plurality of candidates wanted to end all aid to the Ukraine. There were also a couple of dogs that I'm going to stop sharing now. There were also a couple of what I call dogs that don't bark, issues that we looked for that just didn't come up very often. Transgender rights, critical race theory, prescription drug coverage, COVID, for instance. It's interesting that COVID, there's a segment of the Republicans who just were still mad about mandatory vaccinations and mandatory lockdowns. And we were seeing that and obviously the Trump campaign was seeing that this is popular in the Republican base, and therefore it makes sense that Robert Kennedy joined up with Donald Trump. And finally, inflation doesn't show up very much. And the reason, of course, is very simply Democrats simply didn't talk about it. Okay. They just really, there were very few Democrats talking about inflation. Republicans used it more often as a way to criticize President Biden. But that was interesting. Anyway, that ends my quick review of the data we have analyzed so far, that we will be doing a bigger report in the weeks ahead. And now for some commentary, I'd like to turn to our three guests, each one of whom knows a great deal about Congress and elections. First is, are we going to put them up? Yes, good. Okay. First is Daniela Diaz. She is a congressional reporter for Politico. She came to Politico from CNN, where she covered the 2018 midterms and then covered Vice President Mike Pence and Senator Elizabeth Warren. She's at home right now, but she's right in the middle of Congress every single day. Next is Lee Drutman. I'm doing this alphabetically. Lee is a senior fellow in the political reform program at New America. He's the author of Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, The Case for Multi-Party Democracy in America. And he's also the author of The Business of America is Lobbying. Washingtonian Magazine has listed him as one of the most influential people in Washington. Phil Wallach is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies the separation of power, Congress, and the administrative state. His latest book is Why Congress. When he was a colleague of mine here at Brookings, he authored To the Edge, Legitimacy, Legality, and the Responses to the 2008 Financial Crisis. So let me start the discussion and ask each of you, and we'll start with Phil and go to Daniela, then to Lee. What did you learn from this year's congressional primaries? We were madly coding all these candidates and occasionally overwhelmed and occasionally laughing because some of these candidates are pretty funny. But what did you learn from this year's congressional candidates, and what does that mean for the Congress that will convene in January of 2025? Phil.
Well, thanks so much for including me in this, Elaine. I frankly thought that the 2024 congressional season was a little bit less loopy than the 2022 one. We had some characters like former Representative George Santos claimed that he was going to mount an independent bid and storm back into Congress after being expelled, but he ended up shuffling away rather quietly, and of course is on his way to prison instead of Capitol Hill now. And the influence of President Trump, I'd say, was a little bit less aggressively toward unconventional candidates this time around. I wrote an article after the 2022 midterms suggesting that the candidates Trump had pushed in close districts really underperformed and cost Republicans a good number of seats. I think there's still some of that influence this time around, but it does seem a little more muted. So I wanted to say something about the four incumbents who lost in their primary elections this season, because of course that is on everyone's mind when it comes to primaries. The incumbents having to think about losing in that round more than they have to worry about losing in the general election, how that shapes them. I think the lesson I draw is that circumstances have to be really pretty unusual for the incumbents to lose. Overall, incumbents have performed very well this time around. So let's just quickly run through the four who have lost their seats. Representative Jerry Carl of Alabama found himself redistricted because of Voting Rights Act stuff down there. Democrats are probably going to pick up a seat in Alabama. So he found himself facing an incumbent versus incumbent primary. So that's something that happens with redistricting. Of course, an incumbent is going to lose in that case. He lost to Representative Barry Moore. So that's one thing that happened. Then we had another Republican, Representative Bob Good of Virginia, who's the chair of the House Freedom Caucus. Good found himself on the wrong side of President Trump. Trump, sent out a message on his social media platform, "Good is bad," in his immortal idiom. Good is bad for Virginia, and Good faced a very, very close race. It ended up going to a recount, but he did lose to the challenger John McGuire. So that was fairly dramatic that this chair of this organization that's sort of one of the most active in the House lost his seat for the next Congress. So that's certainly a win for Trump. Now, on the Democratic side, we had two of the most progressive members who had joined forces with the Squad. They weren't original Squad members, but later additions. and they both lost their seats. That's Jamal Bowman of I think Westchester, New York, and Cory Bush in St. Louis. Um, Now, those were both very heavily funded races. They both faced very strong challengers with really good support from the Democratic establishment, who had really a lot of concerns about both of those incumbents. And of course, Israel did play a big role in those contests. Both Bowman and Bush were sort of very harsh critics of Israel, and the American Jewish community certainly funded their opponents very strongly, ran a lot of ads, and they both lost pretty solidly. But I would say, there was a sense that it wasn't just about Israel. Really, they had lost touch with the members of their district constituencies. They uh, they did more wrong. I mean, of course, Bowman had this famous fire alarm incident that made people concerned about him. So you really had to do quite a bit to lose your seat as an incumbent this season. So I would say, given how anti-establishment, populist our national political environment is, that's actually kind of surprising that most members hung in there and survived pretty easily. So that's what I took away from this season.
Yep, and that's a good bit of history, because of course that's why losing rates in primaries and the general have been historically, they're very, very low. Daniela, you're in the thick of things. Talk to us.
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit to the amazing context that Philip said about these races. I covered very closely Cory Bush, her primary, and Jamal Bowman's primary. I'm not in the Capitol right now, but I am normally in the hallways of the Capitol chasing these members, talking to them every day. And I think we saw flawed candidates lose their race, their primaries. And that's how we have always described Cory Bush and Jamal Bowman in their primaries. Not only was the influence of AIPAC a major reason why, and the pumping of money from AIPAC to help their primary opponents win against them, a major reason why they lost their primaries, but also they were flawed candidates. Philip mentioned Jamal Bowman in the fire alarm incident. He also was known around Capitol Hill for being very bombastic, making even some of his colleagues angry. That reaches voters back home. And Cory Bush has her own share of scandals, where she is actually being investigated right now by the ethics committee on the Hill for her relationship with her husband, possibly using campaign funds to pay her husband. He was a security guard on her detail. So these are reasons why people tend to lose their primaries. It's not just one reason. They're typically flawed candidates. In the case of Bob Good, he was the House Freedom Caucus chair, but he endorsed DeSantis in the primary. And if there's something we know about former President Donald Trump, and he's not very forgiving about those sorts of things when he was running against president, against Governor DeSantis, Ron DeSantis of Florida. So I see these things on Capitol Hill. And also, I want to go back to the influence of money in these races, especially when it came to Bob Good's primary. He had John McGuire propped up by the Main Street Republican Caucus and Main Street Republicans, which is, an ideological difference, a caucus than where Bob Good is as a very conservative House Freedom Caucus member. Main Street Republicans are more aligned with business interests, or moderate, and they were helping John McGuire in his primary against Bob Good. So these are all very specific reasons why they did not win their primaries. And, we did see other progressive members have money poured in from AIPAC against their primaries. I'm thinking Ilhan Omar, and I'm thinking Summer Lee in Pennsylvania, Ilhan Omar in Minnesota, and they won their primaries. So it's really specific to the district. It's really specific to the voters and how much their last 2 years in Congress can affect how voters see them.
Great. Lee.
Well, delighted to be in conversation with all of you. And one thing that continues to strike me about this moment in U.S. politics is how little competition there is. I mean, there were very few serious challenges to incumbents. And despite the fact that so many Americans say the country is on the wrong track, they say they're dissatisfied with how things are going, they want something different, and yet they keep voting for the same thing over and over and over again. So there's just this incredible disjuncture in the frustration and dissatisfaction that people report in survey after survey, and the extent to which they keep voting for the same candidates over and over again. And a lot of that may speak to just how hard it is to mount a serious challenge in a primary. I think, as you know, we've discussed, members are afraid of these challenges, but in actuality, it is hard to mount a serious primary challenge. You need to be able to raise a lot of money, and usually the party protects its incumbents and is not going to allow a serious primary challenge because of the divisiveness that would create, except for these certain circumstances where the incumbents are actually liabilities for the party as a whole, as I think was certainly the case in 3 of these 4 primary challenges. So, you know, that's one thing that continues to strike me. The other thing that emerges from this careful study, an important contribution of understanding what the candidates are talking about, is the lack of overlap, continued lack of overlap in the positions and priorities of the 2 parties. It's really interesting how, you know, you talk about how Democrats are emphasizing certain issues, abortion, climate. Republicans are not trying to de-emphasize those issues. Republicans are talking about immigration. Democrats are often trying to de-emphasize those issues. So there's just these 2 different worlds, really, that the Democrats and Republicans are inhabiting, and that gets reflected, of course, in this hyper-partisan polarization that we see in Congress. And you know, the reality is that it's going to be an extremely narrow margin, whoever wins in Congress this year. And it just strikes me how much of this essentially it's a coin flip, and you'll get an entirely different set of priorities and positions based on, you know, who knows what what happens, whether some group of voters in Long Island decides to do one thing or another thing on some rainy day in November.
And if I could just add from what Lee said, I was just talking to the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Tom Cole, yesterday, and he was telling me that the time of supermajorities is over. So there will never be a situation in Congress where Democrats have 40 seats where they can really have an agenda, and the Senate has 10 seats and they don't have to worry about the filibuster. This is just not the case of what next year is going to look like, or any sort of terms of what Congress is going to look like going forward. And I found that really interesting, because that means these policies that they consistently talk about on the campaign trail almost can't get enacted. So that's an important thing to know, I think, when it comes to these elections.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things I was thinking of, Lee, when you were talking, and goes to Daniela's point, is the one of the things we've seen over the years we've been doing this is Democrats are almost fixated on healthcare. I mean, they all talk about healthcare. There's actually a lot of candidates who, you know, you don't really expect to win, who end up with 30% of the vote, who are in the race because of a healthcare crisis in their family. And that's their raison d'etre for getting into the race. And then you have the Republicans kind of avoiding this issue like the plague, right? Just staying away from it. None of them, by the way, talked about repealing the ACA, whereas in prior years that was always one of the things that some Republicans candidates talked about. And the result is, of course, that if we ever needed to do something about healthcare again, you have one party that hasn't really thought about it. I mean, and so when Donald Trump said in his debate that he had a big concept of healthcare, of a healthcare plan, everybody made fun of him because everybody knows they don't even think about it. And that's not very good for government, and I think you can say the same thing on a lot of issues where people just won't grapple with it. It's like the Democrats with inflation. They just stayed away from it like the plague. Uh, Other comments? Phil?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you noted that there's not a lot of internal disagreement in the parties about some issues, so you don't expect to see them play out in primary season. So, you know, Republicans don't prefer to argue amongst themselves about the 2020 election, for example. Uh, they want to put January 6th in the rearview mirror, but that's naturally going to be a campaign issue for the general election. We're probably going to hear a lot about it in the next 6 weeks. Uh, so, some of these things are undecided. I also really would just second Lee's comment. It is strange that if we think this is going to be a really a pretty close election, and of course everyone is so much more focused on the presidential election than anything else. Depending on how Pennsylvania goes in November, we're going to put a whole different interpretation on sort of what it is the true heart of the American people really is all about. There's something a little crazy about that. So I appreciate Daniela's wisdom from Tom Cole also. The folks actually down there in Congress, they know that the only way that they're able to get anything done right now, it has been with big bipartisan majorities, right? They pass some bills with 300 votes in the House of Representatives, and that's what they're able to do actually these days. Uh, so, you know, in some ways, we end up getting our attention to both sides of the political spectrum, where there are these characters who catch who do outlandish things, who clearly seem to challenge the orthodoxies, but they're not the ones deciding what goes into those packages that can get 300 votes. So, it's a temptation to give our attention to them, but really that's not where a lot of the action is for governing.
That's right. Lee, one of the questions came in from the audience that I thought might be interesting for you. And it said, is there any political system, any primary system that you know of that could cut polarization? I know you've done a lot of work on this.
Yeah, other than eliminating primaries altogether, and the short answer is no. Now, there's certainly a lot of attention and interest in various forms of nonpartisan or two-round or open primaries, and a few years ago, I just surveyed all the political science literature, including your excellent study with James Wallner, Elaine, and looked. Is a lot of states have open primaries, some states have closed primaries, some states have top two primaries. Is there any difference in who gets elected under these systems? And the answer is no. So no system produces more moderate or more extreme candidates. Interestingly, actually, at the time I did this study, that systems with closed primaries actually produced more moderate Republicans. That was the only finding on the Republican side, which suggests that maybe a lot of the extremists within the Republican Party are actually the independents who, or at least at that time, in the way that Donald Trump did better in open primaries than closed primaries in 2016. I think some of that has changed, but I just think that the causes and forces driving polarization in this country have a lot to do with the geographical sorting of the parties and the way that interacts with single winner elections. And so the idea that you're going to change the primary system and reduce polarization just seems extremely laughable to me, given all the evidence. And, I recommend a terrific new book by Robert Boatwright, Reform and Retrenchment, that's out this year, that looks at the history of primary reform in the U.S. and just shows how little difference primary reform ever makes,
Right.
given the broad macro forces and factors that shape the contours and conflicts of the two-party system in the U.S.
And I might add to that and actually throw out another question that did come from the audience is what do we do about the stark geographic divide between urban and rural voters? And also, I would add to that question between the states. One of the things, since Texas is the first state, the first state in the union that holds a primary, they usually hold their primary in March. So over the years, we've all been inundated and coding the Texas congressional candidates. And oh my God, they are so conservative. They are so really conservative, really MAGA, etc. And people new to our project who've worked with us say, oh my God, everybody's so conservative. And then you get into the other states in the union, and in fact, you find more mainstream Republicans, you find conservatives, you find, much more of a mix. The geographic divisions in the country really seem to, both urban, rural, and then sort of South and non-South, seem to be having a huge impact in terms of who they send to Congress. Does anybody have any ideas about how that may play out in 2025 and if there's anything we can do about it?
Well, I can speak to more of what we can do about it. I will say that there's this weird thing that happens through our use of single member districts, which means that there are a lot of parts of the country that Democrats just don't even bother to contest, the more conservative rural parts of the country, because if you have no chance of getting 50%, then why even bother? So Democrats are basically writing off half of the district, well, maybe like 40% of the district, and leaving those districts to the most conservative Republicans. And so the Republican delegation in Congress is as a result, winds up being from the most conservative parts of the country. And the flip side with Democrats is that Democrats come from the most liberal and cosmopolitan parts of the country. So rural Democrats are nowhere in Congress, and liberal Republicans are nowhere in Congress. So you look at a state like Massachusetts, which is a very liberal state, but it's not 100% Democrat, and yet the congressional delegation there is 9-0 Democrat. In fact, there's not a single elected Republican in the House of Representatives from New England at this point. And that's used to be a great tradition of liberal Republicans in New England, Charlie Baker Republicans. And if there was a way for them to get elected to Congress, I think we'd see a healthier Republican Party. Similarly, I think if there are some of the more conservative Democrats from places like Oklahoma and Plains and other areas, that you'd see some more overlap and more potential for cross-partisan compromise. And we used to see this in an era in which our politics was much less nationalized and local affiliations created tremendous heterogeneity in the parties. Now, that created other problems, but it did allow space for much more creative problem solving. And because of the interaction of single winner elections and geographic polarization and nationalization, you've had this real bifurcation of who the parties represent. And I think that's a real problem. So, I mean, one I think pretty straightforward solution would be to move from using single winner plurality elections to multi-winner proportional elections, where, for example, you could have the entire state of Massachusetts be one district, and then you'd get a range of representatives, or entire state of Oklahoma be one district, then you'd get a range of representatives. So you'd better represent the ideological diversity of this country, and I think that would allow for some more fluid coalitions and I think create a more representative Congress.
You know, your comments remind me of the activities of the Democratic Party chair in North Carolina. Her name is Clayton Anderson, and she's been quite a dynamo down there. And one of the reasons that people are looking so closely at North Carolina is she's been doing a very good job trying to get that party ready to win a very tough state. One of the things she concentrated on was recruiting Democratic candidates for all the legislative districts. And so the same thing happens there at the legislative level. There's just so many districts that are run with no opposition. And I think her insight is that, you know, even if you're pulling Democrats in a very Republican state legislative district, you are in fact energizing some piece of the electorate, and they might vote for the whole ticket. So they might vote for Harris and the congressman and of course in this instance the governor. And so this business of uncontested seats, it really is very interesting, and I think it's very detrimental. If the parties made a bigger effort to focus on contesting seats, you may not win one time, but you may win another time. We saw a lot of, we saw a lot of silly candidates, right, running in 2024 that just were not very serious candidates. But we saw a lot of serious people who had, you know, we had to click through all of their issue positions, and they had really put some thought into it. They had written out their positions carefully, etc. And so there's a lot of talent out there, but a lot of people just don't run. A lot of these seats, you're right, goes uncontested. And maybe if there was a way to encourage more people to run, we'd get a better glimpse. You know, Massachusetts might still be overwhelmingly Democratic, but you might have a handful of Republican members of Congress. They'd probably be more liberal Republicans, but that would be okay too. So that's a good idea. Another question that came from the audience, and you can respond to this or anything else, is it's kind of a sad question. Will Congress ever return to passing a budget on time? Or is this just hopeless? Daniela?
I could speak to that as someone who's currently covering the appropriations process, which is separate than a budget process, but the two are undoubtedly linked. You know, with these really slim margins, it's really difficult because one or two people on either side could really throw a wrench in the whole process when it goes to a vote, either in the Senate or in the House. It really takes bipartisan work to pass bills now, as we mentioned earlier, with the fact that it will just be slim majorities on either side, whatever happens after November. And, you know, there are those, and I think it goes back to that process of, you know, the division between the really conservative members of Congress from the South or from very safe districts, and then really, you know, Democratic progressive members also from safe districts, and they're completely different ideologies on how to run the government. They can't agree on things, and that's what makes it really difficult for bills to pass, especially in the House. And I think if you talk to members on either side, experts on either side, they'll say it's not going to work the way it's working right now. And unless something changes, which it probably won't, either in the process or who people want to elect to Congress from their districts, that the likelihood of, you know, a budget, a bill, any funding bills, anything, or even just anything that's bipartisan at all, or it's really difficult. It's not going to happen. I mean, we're going to be faced with two very, very tough subjects next year, which is why the makeup of Congress is going to be so important. Not only are Trump's 2020 or tax cuts going to expire in 2025, the debt limit will also be an issue that Congress is going to have to address next year as well. So what happens in the next couple of months, what happens after November, will really decide how that looks like.
Yeah. And anyone want to add to that? Phil? Lee?
Yeah, I mean, one of the really strange things in this past Congress is the extent to which the governing majority, which is that, you know, Republicans control the speaker, is very different from effectively the or the from how Congress actually passes bills, and that a lot of these important, spending bills wind up getting passed with mostly Democratic support. So, I can't think of a period in Congress in which you've had the majority party in Congress is actually the minority party when it comes to most of the important bill passages, which is understandably a frustration that some folks on the more Freedom Caucus right have, but they're they're also not doing themselves any help in trying to get more conservative policy. So I mean, it just speaks to the sort of confusion within the current Congress that there is in some ways this kind of multiple parties within a two-party system, where that particularly within the Republican Party, and this is something that I think the primary data shows, is that there is this kind of more mainstream Republican Party that you might think of as the just govern responsibly wing that is kind of keeping their heads a little bit low, but still is voting with Democrats to keep the government funded. And then there's this fire throwing MAGA wing that just wants to do something much more radical, and that tension is held together under the Republican Party brand, but there is quite a bit of internal dissension. There's some within the Democratic Party, although it seems like Democrats have achieved more party unity, which I think is something that seems unusual for those of us who have been following American politics for a long time. That it was the Democratic Party that was a mess, and it seemed like the Republican Party was more in line.
Yeah, I think, a lot of people were surprised at, Pelosi also had very narrow margins, but she actually managed to keep her left wing in check, and they voted for some pretty big pieces of legislation. One of the things that's interesting to me is the sort of anarchistic bent to some of the current members of Congress, where they just want to burn it down and they don't care what happens. And I think that's largely in the Freedom Caucus. That's something that I was very interested in, but it doesn't. It comes through a little bit when you look at 1,000 candidate websites. Comes through a little bit, but you can't really tell from that. Do you know what I mean? You can't really tell how much of a firebrand this candidate might or might not be.
When I talk to House Freedom Caucus members, which I do, I was talking to a couple of them yesterday. When it comes to funding the government, a lot of them say, well, my constituents just want us to shut it all down. That would make them the happiest. It is truly such a division of the way they see, or their constituencies see, funding the government versus, a Democrat from a safe district whose members want, their programs funded, or their constituents want their programs funded. It's just so across the map.
Yeah. And we can see a little about that but you can't really predict that exactly. So, well, listen, we are out of time. Any quick last words?
I would just like to, say the overall configuration of who holds the House, who holds the Senate, and who holds the White House is obviously extremely consequential. So when we think about sort of the position of House Republicans in this past 118th Congress, they were dealing with a Democratic Senate, Democratic president. That puts them at a real disadvantage. It'll be very interesting to see. There's, a very plausible scenario would be Democrats hold the White House and maybe even retake the House of Representatives, but lose the Senate. Because of the map's peculiarities this year, that's a live possibility. And the Senate, of course, has some powers that the House doesn't have when it comes to confirmations. So that would bring us into sort of uncharted territory, and we would have to see how aggressively Republicans, who will, of course, be under new leadership in the Senate come next year, how aggressively they would try to undermine the White House in that scenario. That would be a brave new world.
Well, that's a great ending note. Thank you so much. Thank you to Daniela, to Philip, to Lee. Thank you for listening. Apologies for not realizing my PowerPoint was not on early in the presentation. And everybody have a nice day. Thank you for joining us.